How is it that climate hysteria has taken over the planet while there is no observation from nature that show that variations of CO2 act as an important climate driver? That is what I try to show here in a number of videos. The data, the psychology, who is behind it, and how the marketing technique of this narrative has been made. I will start here with the question, why variation of CO2 is not an important climate driver? Here I am going to show why there is no case for carbon dioxide-driven climate change. In this video I show numbers of graphs as I dig into the science. My name is Per Strandberg and I have a science master's degree in applied physics, and I have studied this subject for nearly 20 years. Why is that important? Well, my experience is that you find more skeptics of dangerous human-caused global warming among engineers and academics in hard sciences such as physics, chemistry, geophysics, and the like. These people are better in examining and evaluating data with critical eyes than activists, whether or not they call themselves scientists or environmentalists. Of course, some scientists in hard science fields are still caught in a thought bubble and victims of groupthink. The notion of 97% of scientists supporting this theory is pure fiction. The climate scare is the greatest pseudoscientific fraud in history, and certainly it's the greatest scam when it comes to cost and its global spread. The economic investment to fight this mirage is massive. My definition of climate scare is here the same as the theory of dangerous human-caused global warming, also sometimes called CAGW, which stands for Catastrophic Anthropogenic Global Warming. The purpose of these videos is to explain to ordinary people on the sideline that think that we have a climate crisis, that we have not. Why this notion is false and how it has even been possible that this theory has taken over the world. How is this possible? In order to explain this, I need to make several videos and explain several reasons and aspects of how this fraud has been created. Is there a big conspiracy theory behind this, or am I an oil-funded misinformation guy? No, I don't get money from the oil industry. Are they powerful financial interests behind the scenes that have funded the climate scare? Yes, they certainly are. People act as sheeple and follow the crowd in order to fit in. People have been exposed by massive brainwashing to believe in the climate scare for over 30 years. It's no wonder that people believe in this. The reasons are many. These days, every weather-related disaster is blamed on global warming in the media without any exception. Group pressure is strong. Scientists can't be wrong, can they? And besides, average Joe is occupied with other things that to evaluate the science or is not capable to do so anyway. Here are 3 reasons to throw the CAGW theory into the dustbin. 1. The tropical hotspot is missing. A central part in climate models that climate scientists have built is that CO2 levels are rising. This should lead to increased temperatures in the higher troposphere in the tropics. That is from the altitudes that airliners fly and a few thousand meters below that. But that temperature increase has not been found from measurements. It's not there. Second reason. Climate sensitivity is low between CO2 and water vapor. Climate sensitivity is defined as the believed temperature increased from pre-industrial level in the year 1880 and with a doubling of CO2 level that is expected in the future. There is no evidence that climate sensitivity is high, which is prerequisite for dangerous global warming to be true. There is no fingerprint made from measurement for high sensitivity from CO2 or for an increase of water vapor from warmer temperatures. This was discovered from the so-called iris effect that was proposed by Richard Lindzen. There are both forces which cause warming as well as cooling that are competing with each other. The greenhouse effect in high clouds near the poles warms the Earth. Low clouds near the equator cools the Earth as the clouds reflect incoming solar energy. It's difficult to find out the level of climate sensitivity, but the global temperature varies depending on if the tropical Pacific is warm or cool depending on El Niño or La Niña. Outgoing radiation measured from satellites follows Stefan Boltzmann law, which is the same as blackbody radiation. No global warming effect can be found from that. If greenhouse effect would impact this outgoing radiation, then the outgoing radiation increase would have a lower value, different from Stefan Boltzmann law. That tells you that the climate sensitivity is low and that we have no climate crisis. CO2 doubling since 1880 should theoretically lead to 1C in itself, without interactions with other forces. I would point out that theoretical calculations are not necessarily true. Third reason. The potential CO2 increase of greenhouse heating is logarithmic and is now nearly saturated. What that means is that the added potential warming of increased levels of CO2 get lower and lower. The combination of these three different reasons should have thrown the theory of dangerous human-caused warming in the trash can. That is, of course, in a rational world. But the world is not rational and is now run by feelings, emotions, and politics. So, we have the combination of lacking the tropical hotspot, outgoing radiation follow black body radiation without the impact of water vapor greenhouse effect, and the fact that CO2 greenhouse effect is logarithmic and is now almost completely saturated. I have not found any fingerprint connection between variations between CO2 and climate forcing. With fingerprint, I mean if there exists any measurement from nature that can link CO2 variations with global temperature variations. If you can find any such evidence, please contact me. I have searched for such evidence for 20 years and not found any. Not once. This graph shows that global temperature rising in climate models, upper red line, is more than what is measured in the real world, blue and green line. The global temperature is supposed to rise exponentially, but it isn't. Water vapor, CO2, and methane are all greenhouse gases. But what are greenhouse gases? Let's start by looking at air molecules and their relation to temperature. Imagine billiard balls representing air molecules, moving around in 3 dimensions and bumping into each other. If temperature increases, the molecules increase in speed. Temperature in the air is a result of airspeed of molecules. If you compress air, the speed of the molecules increases and temperature also increases. Greenhouse gases have additional temperature influence apart from molecule speed. They also vibrate, and this vibration can change when the molecules absorb infrared radiation, also known as heat radiation. This extra heat, when gas molecules collide with greenhouse molecules, can then be transferred to the non-greenhouse molecule by speed increase, or it can be transmitted up into space or transmitted back down towards the ground. This mechanism is not that easy to calculate, and it is complicated. It is different at ground level and different at 10 kilometers up when the pressure is much less. The infrared absorption band of air is dominated by water vapor, which is the dominating greenhouse gas in most places on Earth. However, there are some gaps where the absorption band of infrared radiation of CO2 and methane dominates, but these gaps are small. Doubling of CO2 from pre-industrial levels are theoretically calculated to be 1 degree Celsius, if nothing else is affected. Already 70% of this increase is in effect today. You find only 4 CO2 molecules on average among 10,000 air molecules. Only 1.8 methane molecules are among 1 million air molecules. So, if you look at 10 million air molecules, you find 18 methane molecules. This is nothing you're going to learn about from the advocate of dangerous human-caused warming, as they want to hide this information from the public. This is the temperature graph from University of Alabama in Huntsville, UAH satellite recordings. This is, in my view, the best quality graph of the global temperature. You can see that the global temperature anomaly has increased since 1979 to now, 2020. But if you look at the VY axis, can you see it has increased by 0.5 Celsius since 1979? But recently, January 2021, it is dropping because of La Nina, cooling in the tropical Pacific, and a winter with colder northern hemisphere temperature than normal. As you can see, the temperature increased in a step as a result of a strong El Nino in 1998. Then it stayed stable until the next strong El Nino in 2015 and 2016. El Nino, La Nina, has a lot to do with changes of global temperatures. These temperature variations are mechanical in nature and push warm or cold water to the surface from deeper layers. Here are two different graphs from 1,000 years of temperature variations from IPCC. IPCC is the UN's climate body. One is from the first IPCC 1990 report, and the other is from the IPCC 2001 report. The first report shows large variations over time. It shows the warm period that is called the medieval warm period, which is followed by a cold period which is called the Little Ice Age. This graph is based on credible historical data. The graph of the temperature trends from the 2001 report is from the infamous hockey stick graph that was created by Michael Mann. This graph shows a temperature for about 900 years, and then suddenly it shoots up after the year 1900. I will talk more about this graph in a coming video, but the creation of this graph is based on variations of tree rings and coral samples. The tree rings are taken from bristlecone pine trees. This is a slow-growing pine tree that grows high up in the Rocky Mountain desert regions. This is a tree that grows better with higher rainfall and higher CO2 levels. Temperature variations affect growth less. Then this graph is correlated with temperature recording from weather stations which start in the year 1900. You can see a kink in this graph at precisely that point, and the graph then starts to point up. Needless to say, this graph violates most scientific rules and has been discarded. But this fraudulent graph was exactly what the IPCC and the UN people wanted so that they could more effectively convince people of their agenda of dangerous human-caused global warming. Discrepancy between human-produced CO2 and temperature trends. On the left is a graph over CO2 production from fossil fuel in the world. You can see there, that is only after 1950 that the consumption of fossil fuel really took off. On the right is a temperature graph. A curious thing there is that the temperature rose between 1910 and 1940, as much as it rose between 1975 and 2000. The first temperature increase was before the strong rise of human release of CO2. Was the temperature increase of the first period natural, and the second caused by human-caused CO2? Why can't the second rise have been caused by natural, non-CO2 causes as well? And then we have a cooling period between 1950 and 1975. Actually, the cooling period in the temperature graph is changed to steady temperature, which it wasn't. It was a cooling period, and many climate scientists were then warning that we might enter a new ice age. The people at GISS Goddard Institute of Space Studies only use ground weather stations as well as data from ships. They don't use space data, despite its name. They have changed data over time by cooling the past and warmed data after 1990. I saw this myself because I published 10 years ago the global temperature graph from GISS. The temperature graph showed a temperature increase of 0.8 Celsius from 1910 to 2000. Today, if you look at the current graph, the temperature increase from the same period is 1 degree Celsius instead. Tony Heller has investigated this, and I have added links to 3 of his videos that clearly show what is going on. The first is showing the National Climate Assessment Report and how this report used misleading data. In this video, he demonstrates a software which makes it easier to cheat with data to make it easier for climate scientists to mislead the public. This is what they did with the National Climate Assessment Report, which was presented for the Trump administration. This report was made by activist scientists hired by the Obama administration. Many Democratic cities in the U.S. have declared a climate emergency based on this report and the latest report from IPCC. A must-see video. The second video shows urban heat pollution of temperature recording in and around Buenos Aires from GISS. The third video shows data manipulations of temperatures from Iceland by GISS. They lowered temperature from 1920 up to 1950. They have since corrected this after an Australian politician pointed this out. Temperature variations in Greenland during Holocene. Holocene is the name of the current interglacial and warming period we now live in, which has lasted now little more than 10,000 years. Here we can see temperature variations in Greenland which are based on the distribution on two different oxygen isotopes. The isotope distribution indicates what the temperature was when the snow fell and later formed the glacier ice. These temperature variations are a good measure of climate variation over the northern hemisphere. As you can see, the temperature was warmer 8,000 to 6,000 years ago, which is a climate period which is called the Holocene optimum. Right now, the temperature over time is cooling and is dropping by 0.5 Celsius per millennium. This decline should lead us slowly into the next ice age, but that is many generations from now. The other variations in this graph are caused by solar variations that are superimposed the general trend. Warm Greenland between 1920 to 1950 and warm Greenland from 1990 and onwards. When people talk about warm Arctic and Greenland, they omit or are not aware that Greenland and the Polar Sea experienced a similar warm period between 1920 and 1950. This is well established and is not compatible with the current climate agenda. Variations in solar activity influence temperature. We can see this in this picture. The blue line shows the inverse levels of beryllium-10, which is a proxy for solar electromagnetic activity. The red line shows sunspot variations. Carbon-14 is also a proxy for solar activity linked to climate variations. Proxy is a term for a measured link between fingerprint data and a measured value. This graph goes back over 1,000 years, where the timeline is backward. As you can see, C14 variations comes and goes in ways with distinct low values at regular intervals, which correlate to cold periods. These cold periods seem to correlate to the barycentric movements of the Sun. The Sun is dragged around by the gravitational influence from the large planet of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. When the Sun's movement around the gravitational center of the solar system is regular, the temperature is increasing with higher solar activity. When it is irregular, the solar activity drops and the temperature drops. This theory is contested, but I think it is credible. Right now, the Sun is in an irregular mode and solar activity is dropping. This is from a deep ice core taken from Antarctica at a place called Vostok. The blue line is for temperature and the red is for CO2. Temperature and CO2 levels follow each other. You cannot see this, but temperature changed first, and about 800 years later, CO2 follows. There is no evidence that changes of CO2 cause temperature changes. Al Gore, in his film, have presented this graph with CO2 rapid increasing because of human-caused CO2 added to the atmosphere. In the presentation, he falsely claims that this is proof that CO2 changes are forcing temperature changes. You can see several periods of ice ages. Between those, there were short interglacial periods. They usually last between 7,000 and 10,000 years. Right now, our interglacial period Holocene has lasted for over 10,000 years. One would expect the Earth soon to enter the next ice age, but there are two Milankovitch cycles affecting Earth's orbit. When the orbit becomes more elliptical, Earth enter an ice age. One is about 100,000 years long and the other is about 400,000. Because of the 400,000 year cycle, it is estimated that the next ice age should start 20,000 years from now. But you never know. Temperature and CO2 during the last 600 million years. The blue line is temperature and the black line is for CO2. As you can see, there is no correlation between CO2 and temperature. Currently, both temperature and CO2 levels are at very low levels. During the last 3 million years, we are in an ice age period. The long-term trend has been that the CO2 has been lowered by plants, that have sucked CO2 out of the atmosphere, and this is now the source of much of the fossil fuel that exists today. This is the famous Keeling curve of CO2 that are measured from Hawaii at 4,000 meters above sea level. The zigzag pattern is caused by seasonal yearly CO2 variation because of vegetation variation from winter and summer in the northern hemisphere. The yearly CO2 increase is about 2 parts per million, but that increase varies depending on if there is an El Nino or a La Nina in the central Pacific. Despite massive increase of fossil fuel burning, we only see little increase of CO2. Something other is going on, such as cutting down tropical trees or the use of cement. The variation in CO2 increase is linked to El Nino and La Nina variations. This index is also called ENSO, which stands for El Nino Southern Oscillation. The global outgassing of CO2 is to a large part depending on ocean temperature variations in the tropical Pacific. We can see here that global release of 3 ppm is associated with El Niño periods, and when the release is only 1 ppm, we have a La Nina period. Cold sea surface sucks in CO2, while warm water release CO2. This follows a physical law called Henry's Law. Radioactive C14 of CO2 half-time in atmosphere was shown to be between 5 to 7 years. After the atmospheric nuclear test ban between the US and the Soviet Union in 1963. The radioactive half-time is about 5,000 years. The radioactive C14 is formed by nature as a result of fast-moving galactic proton that crash into the Earth's atmosphere near the speed of light. But during the arms race, both superpowers exploded ever stronger hydrogen bombs in the atmosphere. In 1963, Soviet exploded a hydrogen bomb called the Tsar Bomba, with the explosive power of 50 megaton of TNT at Novozemlya in the Arctic Ocean. The largest oil tanker can carry about half megaton of oil. Imagine if crude oil and TNT have the same density. 100 large oil tankers side by side that are filled with TNT and blow at the same time. This strong and other strong hydrogen bombs increased the amount of radioactive CO2 in the atmosphere. Here we can see a recording of the level of radioactive CO2 from Austria, Northern Hemisphere, and from New Zealand, Southern Hemisphere. We can see how radioactive CO2 is drifting down from the north to the Southern Hemisphere. Despite that this data clearly show that the lifetime of CO2 in the atmosphere is very short and that less than half of the CO2 you breathed out 10 years ago is not in the atmosphere anymore. Some advocates of dangerous human-caused global warming still claim it stays in the atmosphere for hundreds or even thousands of years, which clearly is not true. The argument for such a ridiculous claim is that they have found that the relation between C12 and C13 has changed over time. The difference is claimed to be caused by different relationship from natural and fossil fuel of C12 and C13. And because more CO2 in the atmosphere is from fossil fuel, this quota changes. They forgot to consider that the level of outgassing CO2 also changes and that some of that CO2 comes from volcanic vents at the sea bottom. How could this be? The answer seems to be that the activist scientists regard the gases near the sea surface as part of the atmosphere. I regard that a little bit weird. The amount dissolved CO2 as carbonic acid in the world oceans is 50 more than the amount of CO2 that exists in the atmosphere. CO2 history from stomata. Stomata is the scientific name of leaf openings by which photosynthesis is occurring. Through these openings, the leaf absorbs CO2, while the leaf releases oxygen and water vapor. These data are from fossilized leaf. If the CO2 level is low, the size of the stomata openings are large, but if CO2 levels are higher, then the stomata openings are smaller. The CO2 levels during the medieval warm period and for 200 years afterward were relatively high. There are many uncertainties about CO2 measurements before 1959, but it seems to me that CO2 levels varied more than what currently is believed. One thing is clear, however, and that is that impacts from higher CO2 is that plants and trees grow better and becomes more drought resistant. This effect is large. How much of CO2 in the atmosphere are coming from fossil fuel? This is something I have tried to calculate. I found that about 7.6% of CO2 in the atmosphere is from fossil fuel, and that each year 1.1% of CO2 from fossil fuel is added to the atmosphere. One has to add to that additional CO2 from cutting down rainforest and from cement productions. Also, slightly warmer oceans add to the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And as I showed, El Niño periods add extra CO2 increase to the atmosphere. Globally, sea level changes are measured from tide gauges, and these data show no trend in changes over time. This picture shows sea level changes from New York. Globally, there is a slow sea level rise of about 1.7 millimeters per year that, to a large degree, is caused by a slow warming of the oceans which is not connected to human activity. However, IPCC and many climate scientists claim that the sea level has accelerated since 1990 to now 3 millimeters per year. This is caused by changes in the measurement method. After 1990, they changed to measurement from satellites without calibrate the measurements to the earlier tide gauge measurements. In other words, the apparent sea level increase is caused by scientific fraud. Latitude temperature difference in different climate regimes. You hear many times that the people that are going to be affected the most if the Earth is warming up are poor people in the tropics. Climate activists talk of something they call climate justice. This whole notion is false. Most people believe that if the world is warming up, that the warming is occurring uniformly, but this is wrong. It is in the polar regions and in temperature regions that the warming is greatest. This picture shows that by comparing temperature distribution during a warm period during an age of the dinosaurs and today, you see that the temperature in the tropics hardly change. It is important to understand that temperature and heat content are two different things. Warming cold and dry air is much easier than to warm humid tropical air. The notion that insects would die and food crop would fail in the tropics in a warmer world is false because the warming would then be very small. These false claims are done by activists and often stated in the press as true. Arctic sea ice changes during recent years. Here we can see that despite big headlines, the sea ice extent in the Arctic during the last decade has been small without any trend. The ice extent has declined some since 1980 when the Arctic went through a cold period caused by a cold cycle of the AMO, Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation, which has a 60-year cyclicity. Journalists and politicians know that the ice in Greenland and Antarctica is melting and are nearing a tipping point. The claim by climate alarmists is that the sea level is going to rise by 1 meter by the year 2100. Let's check that claim. I looked for Greenland glacier on Wikipedia. If Greenland glacier would melt, then the sea level would rise by 7 meters, which would be catastrophic. But glacier on Greenland contain 2,850,000 cubic kilometers, and the Greenland glacier is between 2 to 3 kilometers thick. Let's take that again. Glacier on Greenland contains 2,850,000 cubic kilometers, and the Greenland glacier is between 2 to 3 kilometers thick, because 1 cubic meter weighs about 1 ton. Not exactly, but about. This means that 1 cubic kilometer weighs about 1 gigaton. According to the IPCC 2001 report, the yearly melting of Greenland is 40 gigaton, with an error margin of 50 gigaton. In other words, they don't know if Greenland is melting to begin with. Last year, 2020, the ice was melting according to the Danish Meteorological Institute, but the 2 previous years before that, the ice was increasing. Because of the high altitude of between 2,000 and 3,000, the precipitation there is always coming down at snow, even in summer. This adds ice to the glacier. Greenland glacier is not melting. The ice is instead squeezed out toward the edges of Greenland because of the high pressure from the thick 3,000-meter high ice. And if the temperature in and around Greenland rose, say by 5 to 8 Celsius, then the only thing that would happen is that warmer and more humid air would cause more snowfall, and even more glacier ice would be squeezed out toward the edges. Are journalists and alarmist scientists, when they claim that Greenland is at a tipping point, ever going to write that Greenland contains 2,850,000 cubic kilometers and the Greenland glacier is between 2 to 3 kilometers thick? Of course not. But they still are going to claim that Greenland is at a tipping point and that Greenland is fast melting. Why are these people still doing this and lying? That is the question. It is an outrage, and why no people seem to expose their lies is extraordinary. A standard operating procedure among climate catastrophe advocates is to use large numbers without any meaningful reference points, as is the case with the ice melts on Greenland, in order to mislead the public. If 40 gigatons melts, that is equal to 40 cubic kilometer that melts each year. Then this is 0.0014% melt each year. Which sounds more alarming, 40 gigatons of ice melt each year or 0.0014% ice melt of Greenland each year? Another example is the immense volume of Earth's oceans. Image a tunnel with a cross-section that is 10 times 10 meter that is 1 kilometer long. To cover a square kilometer, you need 100 such tunnels side by side. To cover a cubic kilometer, you need to add 2 more zeros. The combined tunnels would then cover 10,000 kilometers. Then change the cross-section to 30 meter wide and 3 meter deep, and you get a swimming pool with the same distance that exists from Lisbon all the way to Seoul across Eurasia. Earth's oceans contain about 1.3 billion cubic kilometers of seawater. If each person, the Earth has now almost 8 billion people, owned one part of the world's ocean, then there would be 5 persons for owning 1 cubic kilometer. Ocean heat capacity is high and moderates the climate, which only changes slowly, except from waters near sea surface. Further, Earth's oceans contain 50 times more CO2 than what is in the atmosphere. The Earth's oceans are far from saturated with carbonic acid that sometimes is claimed. If you like this video, you can support me creating more videos via PayPal and Patreon. But more importantly, spread this video to your friends and around the web. Thank you.